Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We have a really fascinating stack of research to get through today.
Yeah.
I want to start by taking you back in time.
Okay.
It's Easter weekend, 1964. The location is Clacton, a small seaside resort town in England. Now, if you've ever been to the British coast on a bank holiday, you can probably picture the scene.
Oh, yeah. Gray skies, a biting wind, and the smell of vinegar on chips. It's not exactly Ibiza.
It's not Ibiza, exactly. It's wet, it's cold, and frankly, it's boring.
Yeah.
But in 1964, Clacton was packed with teenagers.
Right.
And because it was the 60s, these weren't just any teenagers. You had two distinct tribes present. On one side, you had the mods, sharp suits, Italian scooters, modern jazz, amphetamines. Very clean cut, very stylish.
And then on the other side, you had the rockers.
The rockers.
Leather jackets, motorcycles, grease in the hair, American rock and roll. Two very, very different uniforms, two very different philosophies on life.
And naturally, you put two opposing tribes in a boring town with, nothing to do, and you're going to get friction. A few scuffles broke out. A few windows were smashed. Some deck chairs were thrown around on the beach. By all historical accounts, if you actually look at the police logs, it was minor. It was rowdy, sure, but it wasn't a war.
It was standard holiday misbehavior, a bit of a dust-up. But if you looked at the newspapers the next morning,
Oh my God.
you would think civilization itself had collapsed.
The headlines were just apocalyptic. Day of terror, wild ones beat up Margate, battle for the beaches. I mean, the media painted this picture of a town completely under siege, overrun by these feral youth gangs wielding knives and bicycle chains.
And that disconnect, that massive yawning gap between the boring reality of a rainy Tuesday and the screaming headlines of Wednesday, that is exactly where our deep dive begins today.
Right.
Because there was a sociologist watching all of this unfold. His name was Stanley Cohen, and he wasn't really interested in the fight. He was interested in the freak out.
The freak out, I like that. He realized that society was doing something very, very specific. It wasn't just reacting, it was manufacturing a crisis. And from that observation, Cohen coined a term that I would argue is one of the most essential tools we have for understanding the modern world. He called it a moral panic.
It is, in a way, the operating system for how society scares itself.
I mean, you hear that phrase thrown around constantly now. Oh, it's just a moral panic. But today, we are going to strip that term right down to the studs.
Yeah, let's get into the mechanics of it.
We're going to look at the anatomy of a panic, how it starts, how it spreads, and, why we seem addicted to them. We've got Cohen's original work, we've got the updated checklists from Goode and Ben-Yehuda, and we have a whole history of everything we've been terrified of, from comic books to drag queens.
And the goal here is really to understand the mechanism. Because once you see the gears turning, you just can't unsee them. It changes how you see the news.
Totally. So let's define the beast. How do we distinguish a moral panic from, a legitimate disaster? If a hurricane hits, that's a panic, but it's not a moral panic.
Correct. The key word is moral. Stanley Cohen's definition in his book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, is still the gold standard. He wrote that a moral panic occurs when a condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests.
Okay. Defined as a threat. That feels like the load-bearing wall of this entire definition.
It is. It absolutely is. Because the threat doesn't have to be existential. It doesn't even have to be objectively real in the way we think of it. It just has to be defined as a threat to our values, our way of life.
So it's about perception.
It's all about perception. Cohen pointed out that there's always this discrepancy. The issue might be real. The mods and rockers did throw some punches, but the reaction exaggerates the seriousness, the extent, and the inevitability of the harm.
So it's a scaling error, a fundamental miscalculation of risk.
Yeah.
We take a chaotic weekend in Clacton and we treat it like the fall of Rome.
Precisely. And within this drama, Cohen identified two key archetypes that you see in almost every single panic. First, you have the moral entrepreneurs.
I love that term. It sounds like a terrible LinkedIn bio. Hi, I'm a moral entrepreneur looking for synergy. Who are these people?
I mean, it does, doesn't it? These are the people who start the fire. They're the rule creators. They are the editors, the politicians, the bishops, the heads of pressure groups who stand up and say, something must be done.
The ones with the platform.
Yes. They're the ones who feel that a specific value is being threatened, and they sell that fear to the public. They have a vested interest, conscious or not, in the panic itself.
And who are they selling this fear against?
Well, that's the second archetype. The folk devils.
Right.
This is Cohen's most famous concept. The folk devil is the personification of the threat. It's the mod, the rocker, the drug dealer, the single mother on welfare, the immigrant. The folk devil is the scapegoat onto whom we project all of our collective anxieties.
It sounds almost theatrical. You have your
Yeah.
heroes, the moral entrepreneurs, and your villains, the folk devils, and a plot that everyone just sort of agrees to pretend is real.
It is absolutely theatrical. But and this is important, it's crucial to distinguish this from something like mass hysteria, because people often confuse them.
Okay, what's the difference?
Mass hysteria is usually psychological. It's often about physical symptoms spreading through a group without a biological cause, like, the fainting spells in schools or the dancing plagues of the Middle Ages.
So it's more of a medical or psychological event.
Exactly. A moral panic is sociological. It's about power. It's about how society is structured, how it's controlled, and who gets to decide what is good and bad. It's about social boundaries.
Okay, so we have the players. We have the stage. Let's look at the script. Cohen didn't just name the phenomenon. He actually mapped out the timeline. He argued these things tend to happen in 5 specific stages.
Yes, and once you hear these 5 stages, you will start seeing them in every single news cycle. It honestly ruins the nightly news for you.
Let's ruin the news then. I'm ready. What is stage 1?
Stage 1 is the trigger. Something happens. A specific event. A kid brings a switchblade to school. A fight breaks out on a beach. A specific video goes viral on TikTok. It's the spark.
Right, but sparks die out all the time. To get a real fire, you need fuel.
Which brings us to stage 2, amplification. This is where the media steps in, and this is the part Cohen was most critical of. The media doesn't just report the event, they process it, they frame it. They use what he called simplistic symbolic rhetoric. They create a clear us versus them narrative.
This is where the folk devil gets their costume.
Yeah.
Right? This is where the image is created.
Exactly. Cohen talks about symbolization. The media takes a neutral object, like a specific type of jacket or a hairstyle or a scooter, and turns it into a potent symbol of the threat. Before the panic, a scooter was just a cheap way to get around Clacton.
Right.
After the panic, if you saw a scooter, you didn't see a vehicle, you saw a symbol of violence, of disorder, of the mob menace.
We see this constantly. A hoodie, a pit bull, a certain flag. The object itself becomes radioactive. It's loaded with meaning that it didn't have before.
Precisely. This leads directly into stage 3, anxiety. Public concern rises and rises rapidly. People start believing that this isn't just an isolated incident, but it's a wave of chaos. It's a new trend. The concern spreads from the moral entrepreneurs to the general population.
The mob menace is coming for your town. Lock your doors.
And that anxiety demands action. It creates pressure. Which brings us to stage 4, the response. The gatekeepers step in. Politicians, editors, bishops, police chiefs, they pronounce their diagnoses and their solutions.
We need to get tough on scooters.
Pretty much. And usually this means new laws, police crackdowns, or harsh new policies. They have to be seen doing something to calm the public anxiety they helped create.
And finally, what's the last stage?
Stage 5, resolution. The panic eventually subsides. It either just disappears because the media gets bored and finds a new threat, or it results in lasting social change, like a new law that stays on the books forever. But often, the panic just submerges, it goes dormant, waiting for the next trigger.
So it's a cycle. Wash, rinse, panic, repeat. And Cohen really emphasized that for most of us, the media is the engine that keeps this whole thing spinning.
He argued that for most people, the media is their primary source of knowledge about deviance. You probably don't know a mod or a rocker personally.
Well,
You only know what the newspaper tells you about them. So the media isn't just reflecting reality, they are actively constructing it. They are setting the agenda.
it's interesting, though, because looking at the source material, there seems to be a bit of a split in how experts view this.
Right.
You have the British perspective and then the American perspective. They don't see it in exactly the same way.
Yes, that's a really fascinating divergence. American sociologists, generally speaking, have tended to focus more on the psychological factors. Individual anxieties, why is this specific parent scared of this new music? It's more of a micro-level analysis.
But the British school of thought is different.
Very. British sociologists like Stuart Hall, who is just a giant in this field-viewed moral panics through a much more political and economic lens.
How so?
They often saw moral panics as crises of capitalism or as tools for social control. You have to look at Stuart Hall's work on mugging in the 1970s UK. Mugging wasn't even really a legal term there at the time. It was an American import.
Okay.
But the media started screaming about a plague of mugging, and they specifically relentlessly linked it to young black men.
And Hall's argument was that this wasn't an accident, that there was a reason for this focus.
Right. He argued that the UK was in a deep economic crisis at the time. Capitalism was struggling, there were strikes, high inflation. The panic over mugging served as a distraction. It allowed the state to bring in aggressive policing, more authoritarian measures. It justified a crackdown on a specific population.
So in the UK view, the panic is almost a weapon, a way to keep people in line and distract them from the fact that, say, the economy is tanking.
In many cases, yes. It focuses public anger on a convenient folk devil rather than on systemic failures of the economy or the government.
That is, well, it's cynical, but it also makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, Cohen gave us this narrative process, this 5-act play. But later researchers decided they needed a stricter way to measure this. They wanted a checklist. Is this a panic or is it a legitimate disaster?
Right. This brings us to the work of Goode and Ben-Yehuda in 1994. They came along and developed what's called the attributional model. Basically, it's the panic checklist.
I love a good checklist. So if we are diagnosing a moral panic in the wild, what are the symptoms we should be looking for?
Okay, there are 5 key elements. If you can tick these boxes, you're very likely in the middle of a panic. First is concern. There must be a heightened, measurable level of anxiety about a specific group's behavior. You can see this in polls, in lobbying efforts, or just the sheer volume of news coverage.
Okay, check 1. Everyone is worried. Simple enough.
Second is hostility. There has to be a clear us versus them mentality. The group is designated as the enemy of respectable society. They aren't just different. Their behavior is framed as fundamentally wrong and threatening to the moral fabric.
Check 2. We hate them. It's not just concern. It's animosity.
Third is consensus. There has to be widespread agreement that the threat is real and serious. Now, it doesn't have to be everyone, not 100%, but a significant moral majority needs to agree that the folk devils are bad news.
Check 3. A lot of people agree we hate them.
Exactly. Now, fourth is the most crucial one, and it's often the hardest to prove. Disproportionality.
Okay, unpack that for me. This seems like the most subjective part, especially when you're in the middle of it. How can you tell if something's disproportionate if you're also scared?
It is. This is where the reaction soars far beyond the objective threat. The public concern is orders of magnitude greater than the actual harm being caused. Statistics get exaggerated or even fabricated. Other, much bigger, more common harms are totally ignored.
So we freak out about, sharks, but we ignore heart disease.
That is the perfect analogy. Sharks kill maybe 10 people a year globally. Heart disease kills millions. But we have a shark panic every summer, not a cheeseburger panic. The fear is not proportional to the statistical risk.
Right. Got it. And what's the last one?
The fifth element is volatility. Panics are explosive, they erupt suddenly, they burn incredibly hot, and then they disappear just as fast as public interest wanes, or the media moves on to the next shiny, scary object.
It's like a firework. A huge bang, bright lights, a lot of noise, and then nothing. It's gone.
And Goode and Ben-Yehuda also offer 3 theories on where these panics actually come from, because they don't just appear out of thin air. There's an origin story.
Right. So is this a grassroots thing coming from the public, or is it being pushed from the top down?
Well, that's the debate. The grassroots model says exactly that. The panic comes from the general public. It's a reflection of real, widespread anxieties that just bubble up from below. In this view, the media is just reflecting what people are already feeling.
Okay, so the people are genuinely scared first, and the media follows.
Then you have the opposite, the elite engineered model. This is the Stuart Hall view we just talked about. This is the wag the dog theory. Elites in government or corporate media manufacture a panic to distract from other problems. If the economy is tanking, make everyone afraid of a new type of crime.
That sounds suspiciously like modern politics.
And the third is the interest group theory. This is sort of the middle ground. This is where professional associations, religious groups, or nonprofits launch crusades. They do it to gain status, to raise money, or to enforce their specific brand of morality. They act as the moral entrepreneurs.
So it could be parents genuinely concerned about their kids, or politicians who want votes, or an organization that needs a cause to fight for to justify its existence.
Or, more often than not, it's a perfect storm of all 3 at once. That's usually when you get the really big, defining panics that last for years.
Let's put this model to the test then. I want to look at the greatest hits of moral panic. Because when you look back at history, some of the things we collectively panicked about seem absolutely ridiculous now.
They do. But at the time, they felt deadly serious. The threat felt real.
Okay, let's start in the 1950s. The era of white picket fences, sock hops, and apparently deadly toys.
The switchblade panic.
The switchblade. Now, I know these knives are illegal in a lot of places even today, but why the switchblade specifically? A kitchen knife is just as sharp, if not sharper.
It's a perfect example of Cohen's idea of symbolization. In 1950, a very respectable magazine called Women's Home Companion published an article with the incredible title, "The Toy That Kills."
The toy that kills. I mean, that is a hook. You can't not read that.
It was a brilliant piece of panic-mongering. The narrative was that the switchblade wasn't just a knife, it was a symbol of youth violence, of sex, of delinquency. It was the weapon of the gang, and Hollywood just poured gasoline on this fire.
Right.
Movies like Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story put the switchblade in the hands of the cool, dangerous rebels. The knife became a prop that signified a threat.
So if you were a teenager and you had a switchblade, you weren't just, I don't know, peeling an apple. You were signaling that you were a delinquent. You were part of the problem.
Exactly. And the result of that panic was a wave of laws banning this specific mechanism of opening a knife. Interestingly, many of those laws persist today, even though a modern lock blade knife that you can open with your thumb is functionally identical and just as dangerous. The panic solidified into law.
But the 50s had another target, didn't they?
Yeah.
Something even more insidious than knives. It was just paper and ink.
The comic book panic. This is a classic, a true Hall of Famer.
I really can't imagine looking at a comic book today and seeing the downfall of Western civilization.
In the 50s, though, there was a psychologist named Frederick Wertham. He wrote a book that became a bestseller called Seduction of the Innocent.
Great title. He really went for the jugular with these titles.
He was a master of the panic narrative. He claimed that comic books, specifically the popular horror and crime comics from publishers like EC Comics, were a direct cause of juvenile delinquency. He argued they predisposed children to violence, sexual deviancy, all sorts of things.
Did he have any data to back this up?
His data was largely anecdotal and has been widely criticized and debunked since. He treated correlation as causation. He'd interview kids in reform school, find out they read comics, and conclude the comics put them there.
But almost every kid read comics back then.
Exactly. It's like blaming delinquency on drinking milk.
Yeah.
But the consensus was there. The public was terrified.
And it got serious.
Oh, absolutely. There were congressional hearings. There were literal public book burnings where community organizations, Boy Scout troops, church groups would gather up piles of comic books and set them on fire in the streets.
Book burnings. In 1950s America, over comic books. That's stunning.
And the industry, facing government regulation, capitulated. They created the Comics Code Authority, a self-censorship body which sterilized the content of comics for decades. It banned gore, it banned disrespect for authority figures, it basically mandated that good guys always had to win. It fundamentally changed the entire medium because of a moral panic.
It's just amazing how we always think the medium is the message. If the kids are reading it or watching it or listening to it, it must be brainwashing them. Which brings us to music. The devil's music.
This is a panic that spans generations. It's a shapeshifter. It just keeps coming back in a new costume.
And it started way before rock and roll, right? This isn't just about Elvis.
Oh, yes. In the 1920s, it was jazz and blues. Traditionalists and a lot of the mainstream press labeled it disreputable or often used the racist term Negro music. The claim was that the improvised rhythms and the syncopation promoted promiscuity and a breakdown of morality.
Syncopation causes promiscuity. I would love to see the peer-reviewed study on that one.
It sounds funny now, but it was taken very seriously. Interestingly, even some middle-class African Americans worried about it, fearing it reflected poorly on the community. But this fear just morphed over time. It went from jazz to rock and roll in the 50s to heavy metal in the 80s.
And eventually, that fear of metal music fed directly into the satanic panic. But before we get there, we have to talk about a game. A game played with dice and graph paper in basements.
Dungeons and Dragons.
I grew up hearing about this. My parents were worried about it. The idea that D&D wasn't just a game, but it was a recruitment tool for, well, for what exactly? What was the fear?
For Satanism, witchcraft, suicide, and murder. That was the core accusation. In the 80s and 90s, fundamentalist Christian groups were absolutely convinced that role-playing games were a gateway drug to the occult. They believed kids were learning to cast actual spells and venerate demons.
I played a lot of D&D. I never managed to cast a real spell. I tried.
That's the disproportionality again, isn't it? But connect this to the bigger picture. This fits into a theme that the writer Benjamin Radford identified in a lot of modern panics. The fear of a hidden world of evil that's affecting our children.
Right.
Parents looked at their kids talking about dungeons and demons and spells, and because they didn't understand the game, they filled in the blanks with their absolute worst nightmares.
That theme, the hidden world of evil, it really just explodes in our next section. We have to talk about the Save the Children cluster.
Yeah.
Because this is where moral panic stops being a sort of funny historical anecdote and starts ruining people's lives.
Yes, the satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s is perhaps the darkest and most destructive example of this entire phenomenon.
For those who weren't there or are too young to remember, just describe the scale of this. How widespread was this belief?
It was a massive transnational panic. The core belief was that there was a widespread, highly organized, secret network of satanic cults that were ritually abusing children. And not just abusing them, they were supposedly breeding them for sacrifice, brainwashing them, all sorts of horrific things.
And this wasn't just on the fringe, on late-night radio shows. This was on the nightly news. This was on Oprah.
It was everywhere. It was fueled by a therapeutic technique called recovered memory therapy, which has since been widely and thoroughly discredited. Therapists would essentially guide suggestible patients into remembering horrific abuse that never actually happened.
And the consequences of this fantasy were very, very real.
They were horrific. Wrongful convictions. People went to prison for decades based on zero physical evidence.
We have to mention the West Memphis Three.
A truly tragic case. 3 teenagers in West Memphis, Arkansas were accused of murdering 3 young boys as part of a satanic ritual. There was no physical evidence linking them to the crime. None. But they were black. They listened to heavy metal music, and one of them had an interest in Wicca.
They were the perfect folk devils. They looked the part.
They fit the profile of what the panic said a satanic killer looked like. And so they were convicted. One, Damien Eccles, was sentenced to death. They spent 18 years in prison before finally being released after new evidence emerged.
18 years. Because a community was so gripped by a baseless fear that they couldn't see the facts right in front of them. And then there was the McMartin preschool trial.
The longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history. It started with a single bizarre claim of abuse at a daycare in California. It spiraled into accusations of secret tunnels under the school, of teachers flying, of animal sacrifice, of ritual abuse involving hundreds of children.
Flying witches. People actually believed this in court.
They did. The children's testimony, which was produced after months of highly suggestive questioning, was taken as fact. In the end, no evidence of tunnels or any use was ever found. But the lives of the teachers were utterly destroyed. The school was demolished. The panic left a crater in that community.
It just seems like when children are involved, our ability to think critically just shuts down completely.
It does. The child in danger is the ultimate emotional trigger, and that leads right into the concept of stranger danger.
We all grew up with it. Don't take candy from strangers. It was drilled into us.
And that panic really solidified after the tragic abduction and murder of a little boy named Adam Walsh in 1981. It was a horrific, heartbreaking crime, and it created, as one criminologist put it, a nation of petrified kids and paranoid parents.
But isn't it good to be cautious? To teach kids about danger?
Of course, caution is good. Panic, however, makes for bad policy. The media narrative focused entirely on the predatory stranger lurking in the bushes or in a white van. But the data, the actual statistics, show that the vast, vast majority of child abuse and abduction is committed by family members or people the child knows and trusts.
So by focusing all our energy and fear on the stranger, we're actually looking in the wrong direction most of the time.
Exactly. We built an entire legislative framework, things like sex offender registries, based on this image of the predatory stranger who will always strike again. But the data on recidivism, the likelihood of reoffending, shows that, contrary to popular belief, sex offenders actually have lower recidivism rates compared to many other types of criminals, like burglars or thieves.
Really, that goes against everything we are told.
That's the power of the panic. The fear becomes the fact, and it ignores the data. Paradoxically, by focusing on the monster in the bushes, we often overlook the more common, mundane, and therefore maybe more terrifying reality of domestic abuse happening inside the home. The exceptional rare case drives the policy, while the common reality is ignored.
That is a very sobering thought. We're so busy fighting the imaginary monster that we miss the real one next door.
Let's shift gears a bit to another area where panic often overrides facts: health and social order.
This is a really fertile ground for panic because it involves the safety of our bodies and the safety of our streets. It feels very personal.
Take the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s. A textbook example of a moral panic layered on top of a real epidemic. In the early 80s, the media almost universally labeled it the gay plague.
Which is an incredibly stigmatizing and just factually wrong label.
It did two things. First, it stigmatized the disease, framing it as a moral failing rather than just a virus. It was a punishment. And second, it created a false and dangerous sense of security for heterosexuals.
This can't happen to me.
Right. When it became undeniable that heterosexuals were also at risk, the panic shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just about gay men, it was about the negligence of the younger generation generally. It became a commentary on youth morality all over again.
The same script.
Exactly. And as some scholars at the time noted, the cultural homophobia was so strong that the media effectively blocked out any public health approach that didn't treat gay men as not fully human. The panic prevented a rational, effective public health response for years.
Fear over facts. We see this in legal systems, too. Let's talk about the Dangerous Dogs Act in the UK. This one is fascinating to me because the folk devil isn't even a person. It's a dog.
It is, but it's not really about dogs. In 1991, there were a series of high-profile, horrible dog attacks on children in the UK. The press went into an absolute frenzy.
The devil dogs. I'm sure they call them something like that.
Pretty much. The government, under intense media pressure, rushed through the Dangerous Dogs Act. And it specifically targeted and effectively banned certain breeds, most famously the pit bull terrier. But here is the sociological twist.
Okay.
At the time, pit bulls were strongly associated with the working class, with council estates, with the lower social strata.
Right.
Meanwhile, other powerful breeds like Rottweilers and Dobermans, which can also be dangerous, were largely owned by richer, more suburban groups. Those breeds were mostly ignored by the legislation.
So the law wasn't really about the bite of the dog. It was about the class of the owner.
That's the argument. Critics argue it was a classic displacement of class anxiety. The fear of the subproletarian violent youth was projected onto their dogs. It was a knee-jerk law that punished a breed to try and solve a social problem they didn't want to name.
That is wild. We project our class issues onto our pets. And of course, we can't talk about social order without talking about the biggest one of all, the war on drugs.
A massive ongoing moral panic for over a century. Numerous commissions have found that laws like the UK Misuse of Drugs Act were driven more by moral panic and racial anxiety than by practical harm reduction. But a specific sub-panic here is the date rape drug scare of the late 90s.
Okay, wait. Date rape drugs aren't a panic, are they? That's a real thing. People do get drugged.
The crime is absolutely real. Spiking happens, and it's horrific. But the scale of the specific spiking phenomenon was heavily, heavily exaggerated by the media, creating a disproportionate level of fear.
Okay, so give me the numbers. What did the research find?
Well, a 2009 Australian study is often cited. They looked at 97 patients who were admitted to the hospital emergency room believing their drinks had been spiked. They ran full toxicology panels on all of them.
Yeah.
They found 0 instances of sedative drugs commonly associated with spiking, like Rohypnol or GHB.
0 out of 97.
0. Now, this does not mean spiking never happens. It just means that the public fear of drink spiking as a pervasive, constant threat was disproportionate to the actual frequency. The panic made people believe it was happening in every bar, every night, when the far more common issue was simply excessive alcohol consumption.
It creates a culture of fear. And speaking of culture, let's move into the modern era. Technology. It seems like every time a new screen lights up, a new moral panic is born.
It's the media panic cycle. We saw it with the radio, then with TV, and now with the internet. But video games have been a special, long-running target.
Since the 70s, Death Race.
Death Race, a pixelated black and white arcade game where you ran over little stick figures called gremlins. But the outcry was massive. It was on the news. Then in the 90s, you got the 1-2 punch of Mortal Kombat and Doom.
And then Columbine happened.
That was the turning point. The media, desperate for a simple explanation for a complex tragedy, fixated on the fact that the perpetrators played Doom. They created a simple causal link in the public's mind. Played Doom committed massacre.
It seems so logical to so many people at the time. Murder simulators, they called them.
But the research on the link between violent games and real-world violence has been incredibly conflicting and, for the most part, has failed to establish a causal link. Some experts, like Christopher Ferguson, argued that the media and even some scientists unintentionally worked together to promote unreasonable fear. They ignored the millions upon millions of kids who played Doom and didn't hurt anyone.
And the law stepped in again? Or at least it tried to.
Yes, the state of California tried to pass a law banning the sale of violent games to minors. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, and the court struck the law down. They basically said the research wasn't persuasive enough to override the First Amendment right to free speech. It was a rare victory for evidence over panic in the legal system.
But the panic just moved online. Social media. Do you remember the MySpace panic?
The Deleting Online Predators Act. It sounds so ancient now.
It sounds so archaic now. But in 2005, 2006, MySpace was this terrifying new world. The narrative was that it was just a hunting ground for online predators.
And what's fascinating is what happened. The panic didn't vanish because we solved the problem of online predators. It vanished because everyone moved to Facebook.
Which was perceived as safer because it used real names.
Exactly. The fear was attached to the platform, not the underlying issue. And now we have the viral panics, the Blue Whale Challenge, the Momo Challenge.
Or Momo, that creepy face that was supposed to be hacking into kids' videos and telling them to hurt themselves.
And largely, it was a hoax, or at least the challenge aspect of it was. A few scary images got amplified by concerned parents and local news until it became a global phenomenon. But the themes are so consistent with older panics. As Benjamin Radford pointed out, it's always about an evil stranger manipulating the innocent through a hidden channel. It's the Pied Piper for the digital age.
And that connects directly to something like QAnon, doesn't it? It feels like the ultimate evolution of this.
QAnon is essentially the satanic panic of the 1980s, rebooted for the 2020s, with a political overlay. The core belief is a secret cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run the world. It hits all the same notes: save the children, a hidden evil, a vast elite conspiracy. It's a moral panic that ate a conspiracy theory.
It really shows that these scripts, these narratives, they don't change. We just change the actors on the stage. Which brings us to our final section here, political weaponization. Because these panics aren't just accidents. Sometimes they are very, very useful tools.
Absolutely. The most recurring and politically potent panic is almost certainly immigration.
This one goes back centuries. This isn't a new phenomenon at all.
Not at all. Look at the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s United States. They were a major political force. They won governorships, and their entire platform was a moral panic against Irish Catholic immigrants.
What was the specific fear there?
They feared the Pope. They genuinely believed that Irish immigrants were not loyal to America, but were secret agents of a foreign power, the Vatican, who would destroy American democracy from within. They were the folk devils of the 19th century. And the arguments they used, that immigrants were failing to integrate, that they were straining welfare, that they brought crime and disease, are the exact same arguments we hear today about different groups.
It's the same song, just a different remix every few decades.
Yeah.
And speaking of crime, there's this weird thing that the research calls the crime drop paradox.
This drives criminologists absolutely crazy.
Okay, lay it on me.
Since the early 1990s, crime rates in the US, the UK, and most of Europe have dropped significantly, in some cases precipitously. We are living in one of the safest times in recorded history.
But if you ask people, if you look at the polls,
they will tell you that crime is out of control and worse than it's ever been. Public fear of crime often increases even as the actual rate of crime drops.
Why? What causes that disconnect?
A few things. Herd mentality, and again, media consumption. If it bleeds, it leads. Local news thrives on crime stories, and sometimes it's just a data artifact. For example, Japan had a moral panic in the 90s about the collapse of their famously safe society because crime stats were going up. But it turned out they had just changed how they recorded crime, making it look like it was rising, but it was just a paperwork change.
That is wild. We scare ourselves with our own spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And we can't ignore the contemporary grooming narratives that we are seeing right now.
Since the early 2020s, we've seen this massive resurgence of the groomer accusation, and it's being targeted specifically at LGBTQ+ people, drag performers, and even educators who discuss gender or sexuality.
And scholars are classifying this as a panic.
Yes, scholars characterize this as a classic moral panic. It recycles older homophobic tropes, the long discredited idea that gay people are an inherent danger to children, and it amplifies them through social media misinformation campaigns.
It's the save the children trigger again.
Always. It is the most powerful emotional lever you can possibly pull in politics.
Now, before we wrap this all up, we have to look at the critics. Because not everyone agrees that moral panic is the perfect all-encompassing theory.
Right. It's a powerful tool, but it has its limitations. Some, like the sociologist Steve Hall, argue that the very term panic is misleading. He thinks it might be a category error.
How so? I mean, panic implies a loss of control, chaos.
Exactly. And Hall argues that the state doesn't actually want real panic. It wants to soothe anxiety. He suggests that these panics are actually whipped up by the media only to be calmly soothed by the government saying, don't worry, we're in control, we've passed a new law. It creates complacency, not true panic. It makes us feel like the authorities are taking care of it.
So it's a performance, a piece of political theater designed to reassure us.
And other critics, like Yvonne Jukes, argue that we have to be careful not to dismiss everything as a panic. There's a very real difference between crimes that rightly offend our collective morality like murder or child abuse, and those panics that just serve to demonize minorities. We shouldn't use the term moral panic to brush aside legitimate moral outrage.
That's a very fair point.
Yeah.
We don't want to become so cynical that we think nothing is a real threat.
And finally, a really interesting point was made by McRobbie and Thornton about the modern media age. In the 60s, the folk devils, the mods and rockers, had no voice. They couldn't fight back against the newspapers that were demonizing them.
But today,
The folk devils have TikTok. They have YouTube. They have their own media platforms. They can fight back against the narrative. They aren't just silent victims of the process anymore.
So the panic is messier now. It's not a one-way street of condemnation. It's a two-way street of argument.
Exactly. It's a much more contested space.
This has been, frankly, a little exhausting, but in a good way. It's a lot to process. So what is the big takeaway here? Why does knowing all this matter to the person listening on their commute right now?
It matters because moral panics are a cycle. They are a recurring glitch in our collective social software. We identify a threat, we exaggerate it, we demonize a group, and then we pass laws that often don't work, all while ignoring the actual data.
So understanding this is a way to protect ourselves from being manipulated by that cycle.
Yes. The next time you see a headline that makes you terrified, the next time you feel that powerful urge that something must be done immediately, just pause, take a breath.
And ask the checklist questions.
Right. Is this reaction proportional to the actual harm? Who is the folk devil being created here? Is there real evidence for this, or is it just a powerful symbol being pushed on me?
I'm going to leave you with a final thought. In the 1870s, there was a moral panic about the tramp menace. People were terrified of homeless travelers. Then it was switchblades. Then it was Dungeons and Dragons.
And today, those fears seem almost quaint, almost laughable.
Exactly. So I want you to ask yourself, what is today's switchblade? What is the thing we are collectively terrified of right now that in 50 years people will look back on and say, can you believe they burned books over that? Or can you believe they passed laws about that?
Critical thinking is the only vaccine against the panic.
Don't just consume the fear. Analyze the source. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.